Section 6 of Reminiscences of a Southern Hospital by its Matron, by Phoebe Yates Pember. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. The spring campaign again opened with the usual "On to Richmond." Day after day and night after night would the sudden boom of cannon strike upon the ear. The enemy were always coming, and curiosity seemed to have usurped the place of fear among the women. In the silence of night the alarm bells would suddenly peal out, till the order to ring them at any sudden alarm was modified to a command that they should only be sounded in case of positive attack. The people became so accustomed to the report of firearms that they scarcely interrupted their conversation at the corners of the street to ask in what direction the foe was advancing, or if there was any foe at all. There was such entire reliance in the military power which guarded the city, and former attacks had been so promptly repelled, that whatever was ultimately to be the result of the war, no one trembled for Richmond. So the summer of 1864 passed, and early in September we were gladdened by the tidings that the exchange of prisoners was to be renewed. The sick and wounded of the hospital, but few in number at that time, were transferred to other quarters, and the wards were put in order to receive our own men from northern prisons. About the 20th of September they began to come. Can any pen or pencil do justice to those squalid pictures of famine and desolation? These gaunt, lank skeletons, with the dried yellow flesh clinging to bones enlarged by dampness and exposure, the pale bluish lips and feverish eyes, glittering and weird when contrasted with the famine-stricken faces, the piteous, scarred, flitting smile which greeted their fellow creatures, those they had left could hardly claim the name, will live forever before the mental gaze that witnessed it. Living and dead were taken from the flag of truce boat, not distinguishable save from the difference of care exercised in moving them. The Federal prisoners we had released were in many instances in the same state, but our ports had been blockaded, our harvests burnt, our cattle stolen, our country wasted. Even had we felt the desire to give, how could the wherewithal have been found? But the foe, the ports of the whole world were open to them. They could have fed their prisoners on milk and honey and not have missed it. No tears will drop from the recording angel's eye to blot out one line of the piteous tale. Of what importance is the vice or sin condemned daily, which in most cases hurts the sinner only, compared to the infliction of this horrible, wholesale misery? What is murder, sudden, violent murder, which extinguishes life and with it suffering and sorrow, but a mercy far above the daily torture of systematic starvation and careless cruelty, perpetrated by good people, pious people, who every Sunday meet together to hear the doctrine of universal love? If this was Christianity, then the atonement has failed and Christ has lived and died in vain. But it was no time for vague reflections. With heart beating with indignation, throbbing head and icy hands, I went among this army of martyrs and specters whom it was impossible to realize were human beings, powerless to speak to them, choking with burning hate against their oppressors, but striving to aid and comfort. There was no variety of appearance. From bed to bed the same picture met the eye: hardly a vestige of humanity left in one single man. The passion of intense loathing against those who had reduced them to this caused my hand to shake too strongly to give the bread soaked in wine into their mouths. Many laid with their limbs extended, but some had drawn up their knees, a position that never changed till they died. Their more fortunate comrades said that the attitude had become familiar, as it reduced the feeling of hunger and relieved the pang from which they never felt respite day or night. The Federal prisoners were starved in the South. We cannot deny this. But we starved with them. We did not have the food to give them. May the vengeance that belongs to the Most High fall when it is deserved. Tales may be told to listeners that stir the blood, arouse a gentle pity or a mild indignation, but the Southern woman who has seen the sights that landed from the flag of truce boat and forgets them deserves that God should forget her in her need. One in particular among them lingered in silence the usual 3 days. He was a Marylander, heir to a name renowned in the history of his country, the last of 7 brothers, brought up in luxury and affluence, but presenting the same starved, bloodless appearance they all showed. There was some chance of his rallying, perhaps, with judicious nursing and good brandy. Every precaution was taken, but on the evening of the 3rd day fever supervened, and the little strength he had failed rapidly. He gave me the trinkets he had brought from Point Lookout to send to his family, and one souvenir for myself, begged that he might be buried apart from the crowd in some spot where those who knew and cared for him might find him some day, and died that night. The next morning was the memorable 29th of September, when the enemy made a desperate attack, taking Fort Harrison, holding it and placing Richmond in jeopardy for 3 hours. The alarm bell summoned the citizens together, and the shops being closed, there was no means of getting either a decent coffin or a hearse. There was no time to lose, as it was against the rules to keep the body in the hospital. So the carpenter knocked together a rude coffin, and having the seats taken from my ambulance, the body was enclosed and put in. The enemy were in sight, as, seated on the coffin, I started in the ambulance for Hollywood Cemetery, while from every high point the masses of maneuvering soldiers and flash of the enemy's cannon could be distinguished. Only stopping to buy a piece of ground from the cemetery agent, we reached Hollywood by 11 o'clock. On the way, meeting the Reverend Mr. McCabe, his presence was requested, and we stood by while the sexton dug the grave. The rain was pouring in torrents, while the minister repeated from memory the burial service. Besides ourselves, there were but 2 poor women of the humblest class of life, Catholics, who, passing, stopped and, dropping on their knees, paid their humblest tribute of respect to the dead. He had all the honors of a soldier's burial paid to him, for the cannon roared and the musketry rattled, mingling with the thunder and lightning above. The sexton held his hat over the little piece of paper on which I inscribed his name, to be put on the headboard to protect it from the driving rain, and with a tear of pity for the solitary grave we left, we drove back to the city. The reverend gentleman was taken to his home, and perhaps to this day does not know who was his companion during that sad hour. At midday the city was in the same state of excitement, for no news had been received, except perhaps in official quarters, and it was well known at the time of the attack There were no troops in the vicinity. Instead of returning to the hospital, I drove to the house of one of the cabinet ministers, where I was engaged to dine, and found the mistress of the establishment, surrounded by her trunks and servants, preparing for a hasty retreat should it be necessary. Some persuasion induced her to desist, and the situation of the house, commanding an extensive view of the surrounding country, we watched the advance of the enemy at the extreme northeast, for with the aid of opera glasses we could distinguish the color of their uniforms. Slowly onward moved the bodies of dark blue, emerging from and disappearing into the woods, seeming to skirt around, but never to diminish the distance between, but becoming more distinct, which proved their advance, while not a single Confederate jacket could be seen over the whole sweep of ground. Half an anxious hour passed, and then one single horseman in the beloved gray appeared, like a phantom, far to the northeast, leader of many that followed, winding round and cutting off the foe. Then a peal at the bell, and a courier brought the news that Wade Hampton and his cavalry were in the rear of the enemy. There was no fear after this, for Hampton was the Montrose of the Southern army, he who could make any cause glorious with his sword and famous with his pen. The dinner was put in course of preparation, and was seasoned, when served, by spirits brightened by reaction. The horrors that attended in other and past times the bombardment of a city were experienced to a great degree in Richmond during the fighting around us. The close proximity to the scenes of strife, the din of battle, the bursting of shells, the fresh wounds of the men hourly brought in, were daily occurrences. Walking home after the duties of the hospital were over, often when evening had well set in, during this time the pavement around the railroad depot would be lined with wounded men, laid there to wait for ambulances to take them to the receiving hospital, some on stretchers, others on the bare bricks or a thin blanket, suffering from wounds hastily wrapped around with the coarse, galling, unbleached homespun bandages, in which the blood had stiffened till every crease cut like a knife. Women passing like myself would put down their basket or bundle, and ringing at the bell of any neighboring house, ask for basin and soap and a few soft rags, and going from one sufferer to another, alleviate with what skill they had the pain of wounds, change the uneasy position, and allay the thirst. Many passing would stop and look, till the labor appearing to require no particular skill, they too would follow the example set them, and asking occasionally a word of advice, do their part carefully and willingly. Idle boys passing would get a pine knot or tallow candle, and stand quietly as torch-bearers, till the scene with its gathering accessories formed a strange picture not easily forgotten. Persons passing in vehicles would sometimes alight, and, choosing the patients most in want of surgical aid, put them in and send them to the Seabrook Hospital, continuing their way on foot. There was very little conversation carried on, no necessity for introductions, and no names ever asked. This last was a peculiarity strongly exhibited in the hospitals, for after nursing a sick or wounded patient for months, he has left very often without any curiosity as regarded my name, whereabouts, or anything else concerning me. A case in point was related by a friend. When the daughter of our general had devoted much time and care to a sick man, he seemed to think so little about the attention paid, that her companion, to rouse him, told him that Miss Lee was his nurse. "Lee, Lee," he said, "there are some Lees down in Mississippi who keep a tavern. Does she belong to them?" Almost as uncomplimentary was the remark of one of my sick, a poor fellow who had been wounded in the head, and, though sensible enough when in the ward, would feel the effect of the sun in his brain whenever he was exposed to its influence. After advising him to wear a wet paper in the crown of his hat, more from a desire to show some interest in him than from any belief in its efficacy, I stopped at the door, and heard him ask the ward master who that was. "Why, that is the matron of the hospital. She attends to having everything nicely done for you." "Well," said he, "I always did think this government was a confounded sell, but now I am sure of it, when they put a little fool like that at the head of such a big hospital as this." Their ingenuity was wonderful in making little toys and trifles, and a great deal of mechanical talent displayed. Every ward had its draught board, and draughtsmen cut out of hardwood and stained with vegetable dyes, and sometimes chessmen would be cut out with a common knife, in such an ornamental way that they would not have disgraced a drawing room. One man carved pipes from ivy root, with exquisitely cut shields on the bowl, bearing the arms of the different states and their mottos. He would charge and easily get $150 for his work, and only used his well-worn knife. Playing cards were difficult to imitate, so that any original packs had a hard time of it. They were, as may be supposed from the hands that dealt them, very dirty, and the corners by no means in a respectable condition. But after the diffusion of the Oxford-bound books of the Bible, the soldiers took a lesson and rounded the corners in imitation. A pack of cards, after 4 years' use in a Southern hospital, was beyond criticizing. The men had their fashions too, sometimes insisting upon drawing light blue pants, and at other times preferring gray. But while the mania for either color raged, they were dissatisfied with the other. When the quartermaster issued canvas shoes, there was general dissatisfaction and grumbling, till some original genius changed the whitish hue of the material by a liberal application of pokeberries. He was the Brummel of the hospital, and for many months crimson shoes were the rage, and long rows of unshod men would sit under the eaves of the wards, all diligently employed in the same labor and up to their elbows in red juice. This fashion died out and gave place to a button mania. Men who had never had a hope or a thought beyond horn ones saved up their means to replace them with gilt, and made neat little wooden shelves with a slit through which the buttons slid, so that they could be cleaned without soiling the jacket. With the glitter of buttons came the corresponding taste for gilt bands and tinsel around the battered hat. The duty of all others that pressed most heavily upon me, and which I could not perform, was that of telling a man he could not live, when he was, perhaps, unconscious that there was any danger in his wound. The idea of death so seldom occurs when disease and suffering has not wasted the frame and destroyed the vital energies, that there is little opening or encouragement to commence such a subject, unless the patient suspects the result ever so slightly. In many cases, too, the yearning for life was so strong that to destroy that hope was beyond humanity. Life was a furlough with him, family and friends once more around. A future was all he wanted, and considered it cheaply purchased, if for only a month, by any wound, however painful or tiresome. There were long discussions among the soldiers and outsiders during the war concerning unnecessary amputations on the field, and often when a fine-looking, hearty young man would be brought in with a leg or arm cut off, I would feel that it might have been saved. But experience taught me the wisdom of these prompt measures. Poor food and exposure had thinned the blood and broken down the system so much that all secondary amputations performed in the hospital almost invariably resulted in death. The blood lost on the battlefield when the wound would be first received would pull down the already impaired system and render it incapable of further endurance. Once we received a strong, stalwart soldier from Alabama, and after 5 days, finding the inflammation from the wound in his arm too great to save the limb, the attending surgeon requested me to feed him on the best I could command, by that means to try and give him strength to undergo amputation. Irritability of stomach, as well as indifference to food, always accompanying wounds while the fever continued, it was necessary to give him as much nourishment in a small compass as possible, as well as easily digested food that would assimilate with his system. Beef tea he could not or would not take, or anything that would give strength. So, asking him if he would drink some chemical mixture, and receiving his consent, I prepared the infusion. Chipping up a pound of beef, and pouring upon it a pint of water, it was stirred until all the blood was extracted and only the white fibre left, and with a little salt added, favored by the darkness of the corner of the ward in which he laid, I carried it to him. He drank the infusion without suspicion, and fortunately liked it, so that by the end of a week his pulse was as strong as that of a healthy man, and there had been no accession of fever. Every precaution was taken, both for his sake and the benefit of the experiment, and the arm taken off by the most skilful surgeon we had. An hour after the amputation he looked as bright and well as before, and so on for 5 days. But then the usual results followed. The system proved not strong enough to throw the pus or inflammation, and this mingling with the blood produced that most fatal of all diseases from wounds, called pyemia, from which no man ever recovered. He was only one of numerous cases, so that my heart beat twice as fast as ordinarily whenever there were arrangements progressing for amputations after there had elapsed any time, or any efforts had been made to save the limb. The only cases that survived were 2 Irishmen, and it was really so difficult to kill an Irishman that there was little room for boasting on the part of the officiating surgeons. One of those mentioned had his leg cut off in pieces, amputation having been performed 3 times, and the last heard from him was that he had married a young wife and settled down on a profitable farm in Macon. He had touched the boundary of the unknown land, had been given up by the surgeons, who left me with an order to stimulate him if possible. The priest was naturally angry at my disturbing what he considered were the last moments of a dying man, which ought to have been devoted to less earthly temptations than mint juleps, and a rather brisk encounter was the result. But if he was responsible for the soul, so was I for the body, and I held my ground firmly. It was hard for an Irishman and a good Catholic to have to choose at such a moment between whiskey and religion. But though his head was turned toward good Father T., his eyes rested too lovingly on the goblet held so near his lips to allow any mistake as to his ultimate intentions. The interpretation put on that look was, to my mind, to the effect that Callahan thought, as long as brandy and mint lasted in the Confederacy, that this world was good enough for him, and the result proved that I was not mistaken. He always gave me the credit I have awarded to the juleps, and, till the evacuation of Richmond, kept me informed as to his domestic happiness. Section 7